Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brashear-Pashman. In October 2023, journalist Yardena Schwartz was in the middle of writing her first book, exploring the rarely talked about 1929 Hebron Massacre, in which nearly 70 Jews were murdered, dozens more injured by their Muslim neighbors during riots incited by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who spread lies that Jews wanted to take over the Al Aqsa Mosque. When she heard reports of the October 7th terror attacks by Hamas, dubbed Operation Al Aqsa, she realized just how relevant and prescient her book would be, and began drafting some new chapters. Yardena is with us now to discuss that book, titled Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict. Yardena, welcome to People of the Pod.
Great to be here, Manya.
So, full disclosure to you and our audience, you attended Columbia Journalism School 10 years after I did, and you took Professor Ari Goldman's class on covering religions 10 years after I did. That class had always traveled to Israel, and I had hoped it would be my ticket to go to Israel for the first time, but the Second Intifada prevented that, and we went to Russia and Ukraine instead. Your class did go to Israel, and that was your first visit to Hebron, correct?
So it was in 2011, and we went to Hebron for one day out of our 10-day trip to Israel, and it was my first time there. I was the only Jewish student in our class. It was about 15 of us, and I was the only one who had been to Israel. I had been all over Israel, but I had never been to Hebron. And our tour was with Breaking the Silence, an organization of former Israeli soldiers who had served in Hebron or in other parts of the West Bank and wanted Israelis to know what was happening in Hebron and how Palestinians were living there and the various restrictions that were put in place as a result of terrorist attacks. But nevertheless, those restrictions were extremely disturbing. And that brief visit in 2011 made me really never want to go back to Hebron. And when I moved to Israel 2 years later to become a freelance journalist there and, to move to Israel because I loved Israel and still obviously love Israel, I didn't really go back to Hebron because I, was really troubled by what I saw there. But this book took me, of course, back to Hebron hundreds of times, spending hundreds of hours there. And it came to be, my expertise in this conflict in my reporting. And, of course, Hebron is kind of the main character in this book.
Tell us how you came to find out about this massacre. Was it mentioned during that class visit in 2011, or was it later that you learned about it?
So that was one of the most interesting things about my early adventure into writing this book was that I had, of course, been to Hebron. And yet during that day that we spent there learning so much about the history of this place, this deeply holy place to so many people, there was no mention of the massacre of 1929. So, I knew that Hebron is, the second holiest city in Judaism, the burial place of Abraham and the matriarchs and patriarchs of the Jewish people. And, the first place where King David established his kingdom before Jerusalem. So it was holy before Jerusalem. And yet I had no idea that this ancient Jewish community in Hebron had been decimated in 1929 in one of the worst pogroms ever perpetrated. We all know about the Kishinev pogrom of 1904. And yet the pogrom in 1929 in Hebron, perpetrated by the Muslim residents of Hebron against their Jewish neighbors, was more deadly and more gruesome than the Kishinev pogrom. And it effectively ended thousands of years of Jewish presence in this holy city. And so when I was told by my mentor, Yossi Klein Halevi, the amazing writer, that there was a family in Memphis, Tennessee that had discovered a box of letters in their attic written by a young American man from Memphis who had traveled to Hebron in 1928 to study at the Hebron Yeshiva, which was at the time the most prestigious yeshiva in the land of Israel, in what was then, of course, British Mandate Palestine. and that this young man had been killed in that massacre, yet his letters, painted this vivid portrait of what Hebron was before the massacre that took his life. I was immediately fascinated. And I, wanted to meet this family, read these letters, and see how I could bring this story to life. And I was introduced to them by Yossi in 2019. So that's when I began working on my book. And, as you mentioned, I was still writing the book in 2023 on October 7th. And this book I had been writing about this massacre nearly a century ago immediately became more relevant than I ever hoped it would be.
The young American man from Memphis, his name was David Schoenberg. Give our listeners a history lesson. Tell us about this 1929 massacre.
So on August 24th, 1929, also a Shabbat morning in Hebron, every Jewish family had locked their doors and windows. They were cowering in fear as thousands of Muslim men rioted outside their homes, throwing rocks at their windows, breaking down their doors, and essentially hunting down Jews, much like they did on October 7th. Families were slaughtered. Women and teenage girls were raped by their neighbors in front of their family members. Infants were murdered in their mother's arms. Children watched as their parents were butchered by their neighbors. Rabbis, yeshiva students were castrated. And Arabic-speaking Jews, Sephardi, Mizrahi Jews who composed about half of the Jewish population in Hebron at the time and were very friendly with their Arab neighbors. They went to each other's weddings and holidays, went to each other's shops. And these people were also slaughtered. It wasn't just the yeshiva students who had come from Europe or from America to study there, or, the Ashkenazi Jewish families. It was, Arabic speaking Jews whose families had been there for generations and had lived side by side in peace with their Muslim neighbors for centuries. They too were slaughtered.
Why did their Muslim neighbors turn on them so suddenly and violently?
The rioters that day were shouting Allahu Akbar. They claimed to be defending Islam and Al Aqsa from this supposed Jewish plot to destroy Al Aqsa in order to rebuild the third temple. This is what they had been told by their leaders and by imams in their mosques. And in Hebron, that lie had also extended to the Tomb of the Patriarchs and Matriarchs, which is known in Arabic as the Ibrahimi Mosque. Imams there had told Muslims in Hebron that the Jews of Hebron were planning to conquer Ibrahimi Mosque in order to turn it into a synagogue. So this incitement and this disinformation that continues to drive the conflict today really began in 1929. The rumors about this supposed Jewish plot to destroy Al Aqsa, that began in 1928, around the same time that David Schoenberg arrived in Palestine to study at the yeshiva.
So in addition to the letters that David Schoenberg wrote to his family back in Tennessee, how else did you piece together this history? How did you go about reporting and researching it? Who kept records?
So it's really interesting because I was so surprised by the lack of literature on this really dramatic moment in history, in the history of Israel, the history of this conflict. And yet, despite the fact there are really no books in English, at least, about the massacre and about these riots and what led to them, there were mountains of, testimony from victims and survivors. The British carried out this commission after the riots that produced this 400-page report filled with testimony of British officials, Arab officials, Jewish officials, survivors. So there was just so much material to work with. Also, survivors ended up writing books about their experiences in Hebron, very similar to David's letters in a way, because they wrote not only about the riots and the massacre itself, but also what they experienced in Hebron before. They too wrote about, the relatively peaceful relations between the city's Jewish minority and the Arab majority. And I also relied on archival newspaper reports. So the riots really occupied the front pages of American newspapers for about a week, because it took about a week for the British to quell the riots. And they did so with an air, land, and sea campaign. They sent warships and warplanes from across the British Empire and sent troops from other parts of the British Empire, because one of the reasons the riots were so effective in a way, were so deadly, especially in Hebron, was because there was just no military force in Palestine at the time. The British did not have a Palestine military force. And it was only after the 1929 riots that they did have troops in Palestine. Until then, they had the Palestine police force, and that police force was mostly Arabs. In Hebron, for example, there were about 40 policemen under the stewardship of one British police chief, and all but one of those policemen were Arabs, and many of them participated in the massacre or stood by outside of Jewish homes and allowed the mobs to, enter the homes and carry out their slaughter.
And I'm curious, there was a lot of newspaper coverage, but what about the international community's response beyond the British Empire?
So there were actually protests around the world against the massacre. In New York, 35,000 people marched through the streets of Manhattan to protest the British failure to protect their Jewish subjects from these riots. Most of the marchers were Jewish, but nevertheless, 35,000 people. We didn't see anything like that after October 7th. Of course, we saw the opposite, people marching through the streets of New York and cities around the world supporting the massacre of October 7th. I mentioned this march in New York, but similar protests were held around the world, mostly in Jewish communities. So in Poland and Warsaw. And in England, there were protests against the British failure to protect Jews in Palestine from these riots. And the American government was livid with the British, and they sent statements, put out statements to the press criticizing the British inaction, the British failure to protect the Jewish subjects and the American citizens who were in Palestine at the time. There were 8 Americans killed in Hebron on August 24th, 1929, out of the 67 Jewish men, women, and children who were killed, and all of them were unarmed. The Haganah at the time, the underground Jewish defense force that would later become the nucleus of the IDF, the Haganah was active then mostly in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. There were no Haganah members in Hebron. The Hebron Jewish community was very traditional, very religious. And when the Haganah came to Hebron 2 days before the riots erupted, because they knew that these riots were going to happen, there had been calls from Arab officials to riot, to attack Jewish communities across Palestine. And so the Haganah came to Hebron to warn Jewish leaders of Hebron that they could either come there to protect them or evacuate them to Jerusalem to safety until the riots subsided. And the Jewish leaders of Hebron were unanimous in their opposition. They said, no, we're friends with our Arab neighbors. They'll never hurt us. We trust them. If anything happens elsewhere, it won't happen here. And they believed that not only because they had such a good relationship with their Arab neighbors and friends, but also because in previous outbursts of violence in other years, like in 1920 and 1921, when there were much smaller riots and much less deadly riots, when those riots reached other parts of Palestine, they didn't reach Hebron because of those relations and because they weren't fueled by incitement and disinformation, which was what led the riots of 1929 to be so massive and so deadly, and what led them to be embraced by previously peaceful neighbors.
How did that disinformation travel in 1929? How did it reach those neighbors in Hebron?
When we talk about disinformation and misinformation today, we think of it as this, modern plague of the social media era or, our fractured media landscape. But back in 1929, disinformation was rampant, and it also traveled through Arabic newspapers. They were publishing these statements by Arab officials, mostly the Grand Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was the leader of Palestinian Muslims under British rule. He began this rumor that the Jews of Palestine were plotting to conquer Al Aqsa Mosque to rebuild their ancient temple. Of course, Al Aqsa is built upon the ruins of the ancient temples. Temple Mount is the holiest place for Jews in the world. And in 1929, Jews were forbidden from accessing the Temple Mount because it was considered, a solely holy Muslim site. but the closest place they could pray was the Western Wall, the Kotel, and Jews who were demanding British protection to pray in peace at the Western Wall without being attacked by Muslims as a result of this disinformation campaign were then painted by the Arabic press as working to conquer the Western Wall, turn it into a synagogue, and then from there take Al Aqsa Mosque. So this disinformation traveled from the very highest of Muslim officials. So the imams in mosques across Palestine, specifically in Al Aqsa and in Hebron, were repeating these rumors, these lies about this supposed Jewish plot. Those lies were then being published in flyers that were put in city squares. Jewish officials were warning the British and telling, they should have known and they should have done more to end this campaign of disinformation, not only to achieve peace in this land that they were ruling over, but also because they were responsible for installing Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, into his position. They had chosen him for that position, that all-powerful position. And so they were responsible in a way for all of these lies that he was spreading, and yet they took no responsibility. And even in the commission that they sent to Palestine from London to investigate the causes of the riots, despite the fact that, if you read these, 400 pages, I don't recommend it. It's tough reading, but, I did that for this book. And it's so clear from all of these hearings that this disinformation campaign was very obvious, very clear, and very clearly to blame for the riots. And yet, because saying so would have made the British responsible for so much death, their conclusions in this commission was that it was Jewish immigration to Palestine and Jewish land purchases at the time that had sparked the riots, and that it was this Jewish demonstration, peaceful demonstration at the Western Wall on Tisha B'Av in August of 1929 that had sparked these riots. So there's just, this absolute lack of accountability, not only for the Mufti, who retained his position and became even more powerful and more popular as a leader after these riots, but also for the British. And instead, the Jewish victims were blamed for their suffering. At the time, Jews were just 20% of the Palestinian population, which was just 1 million people. Of course, today, Israel is home to more than 10 million people. So, clearly there was room for everyone. And the Jews at the time were very peaceful. The Haganah was a very, weak, decentralized force. And after these riots, it became much stronger. And Sephardi Jews and Mizrahi Jews, more traditional Jews who had not joined the Haganah before 1929, had not really embraced Zionism before 1929, now agreed that if Jews were going to be safe in our homeland, then we would need our own army.
Can we talk a little bit about the turn toward radicalization and extremism during this time and what role that has played in the years since?
The Zionist leadership was very adamant that Jews in Palestine should not be carrying out attacks against Arabs in Palestine. It should be really about defending Jews, preventing attacks, but not carrying out retaliatory attacks. But as we've seen throughout the century of this conflict, extremism begets extremism. And, when violence is being used by one side, it is going to be used by the other side as well. And so the rise of a more militant form of Zionism was a direct result of 1929 and this feeling of just helplessness and this feeling of relying on this foreign power, the British, to protect them, and realizing that no foreign power was going to protect the Jews of Palestine and that Jews would have to protect themselves. And the radicalism and the extremism within the Muslim population, particularly the Muslim leadership of Palestine, really just accelerated after the massacre because they saw that it succeeded. I mean, the British punished the Jewish population of Palestine for the riots by vastly limiting Jewish immigration, vastly limiting Jewish land purchases. Notice I use the word land purchases because contrary to a lot of the disinformation we hear so much today, none of this land was being stolen. It was being purchased by Jews from Muslim landowners. Many of them were absentee landowners. Many of them were from the wealthiest families in Palestine. And many of them were members of, this anti-Zionist, pro-Mufti circle who were then telling their own people that Jews are stealing your land and evicting you from your land, when in fact it was these wealthy Arab landowners who were selling their land to Jews at exorbitant prices.
Did you establish a motive for the Mufti? And what were his intentions spreading this disinformation?
Great question. So it was very clear. I mean, he never admitted this, but it was very clear what his motives were. And that was to counter the criticism and accusations of corruption that had dogged him for years until he began this campaign of propaganda, which led much of that criticism and much of those stories of his corruption within the Arabic press and among his Arab rivals to essentially disappear, because now they had a much more threatening enemy. And that enemy was the Jewish community of Palestine, who was plotting to destroy Al Aqsa, conquer Al Aqsa, rebuild their temple, take over Palestine. And his campaign worked. After that propaganda campaign became so successful, there were very few people willing to stand up to him and to criticize him, because after 1929, when he became so much more powerful, he began a campaign of assassinations and intimidation and violence used against not only his political rivals and dissidents, but also just anyone who favored cooperation between Arabs and Jews in Palestine. So there were various mayors of Arab cities who wanted to work together with the Jewish community of those cities or with other Jewish leaders to bring about various economic initiatives, for instance. And some of those mayors were assassinated by the Mufti's henchmen, or they were just intimidated into silence and into kind of embracing his platform, which was that Palestine is and has always been and should always be a purely Muslim land, and that there is no place for any kind of Jewish sovereignty or Jewish power in that land. So, the Mufti in 1936, he ended up leading a violent rebellion against the British. And the British at that point had gotten tired of ruling Palestine. They realized it was much more work than they were interested in doing. And they were interested in leaving Palestine, handing over governance to the local population, to the Jews and Arabs of Palestine. And they had been interested in figuring out what could be done. Could there be a binational state with equal representation, or representative governance? If Jews are 40% of the population and Arabs are 60%, then there could be some kind of governance on those ratios. All of those solutions, including a two-state solution, which was presented in 1937, all of those solutions were rejected by the Grand Mufti. And his platform was embraced by the other Arab officials within Palestine, because if it wasn't, they could face death or violence. And he even rejected the idea of Jews remaining in Palestine under Arab rule. When the British said to him, okay, so what will be done with the 400,000 Jews who are in Palestine right now? He said they can't stay. So he didn't only reject the two-state solution, he rejected, this binational, equal, utopian society that we hear proposed by so many in pro-Palestine movement today. All of these solutions have been on the table for a century, and always they have been rejected by Palestinian leaders, whether it was the Grand Mufti or his apprentice, his young cousin, Yasser Arafat.
Ah, okay. So what happened to Grand Mufti Husseini? Did he stick around?
So the Mufti was finally wanted for arrest by the British after his rebellion claimed the life of a British official. Until then, it had only claimed the lives of Jews and Arabs. But once a British official was killed, then the British had decided that they'd had enough of the Mufti, and they ordered his arrest. He fled Palestine. He ended up in Iraq, where he was involved in riots there, the Farhud, in which many Jews were massacred. Perhaps hundreds, if not over 1,000 Jews were slaughtered in Baghdad, which was at the time home to about 100,000 Jews. He then fled Iraq and ended up in Berlin, where he lived from 1941 to 1945 in a Nazi-financed mansion. And he led the Arab branch of Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. He was the Nazis' leading voice in the Arab world. He spread Nazi propaganda throughout the Muslim world and recruited tens of thousands of Muslims to fight for the Nazis, including in the Waffen SS. And when the war ended, when World War II ended and the UN wanted him for Nazi war crimes, he was wanted for Nazi war crimes, placed on the UN's list of Nazi war criminals. Once again, he fled, first to France, then to Cairo, eventually settling in Beirut, where he continued to lead his people's jihad against the Jews of Palestine. So in 1947, when the UN voted to partition British Mandate Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state so that the British could finally leave Palestine, he declared jihad and he rejected the partition plan along with every other Arab state, which also rejected it. Of course, the Jews of Palestine embraced it, celebrated it. And the very next day after the UN vote, riots erupted throughout Palestine, and he was kind of pulling the strings of that jihad taking place in Palestine. And in fact, 1,000 Muslim men who he had recruited for the Waffen SS joined that holy war in Palestine. The Mufti helped create the Army of the Holy War. Yasser Arafat, who was also in Beirut at the time, also assisted the Army of the Holy War. He actually fought in the war that began in 1947 alongside the Muslim Brotherhood. So, the legacy that the Mufti had, it doesn't end there. It continued to his dying day in 1974. And Arafat took over his mantle as the leader of the Palestinian people. And, we see how the disinformation and incitement and rejection of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the ancient land of Israel has continued to be a prominent force in Palestinian politics, no matter who was in charge. The Fatah, Mahmoud Abbas, and Hamas, of course, perpetuate the same lies about Al Aqsa. They perpetuate the same denial of a Jewish right to live in peace in our homeland, deny the history of Jewish presence in Israel. So, it's really astounding to me how little is known about the Grand Mufti and how little is known about his impact on this conflict, and particularly in the very beginnings, the ground zero of this conflict in 1929.
It's so interesting. We talk so much about Hitler, right, and his anti-Semitism, but we don't talk about Husseini.
Yeah, and they were good friends. I mean, they met in 1941, shortly after the Mufti arrived. He had a private chauffeur. He was lavishly paid by the Nazis, and he was good friends with Himmler. He toured concentration camps. He knew very well about the final solution. Hitler himself considered the Mufti an honorary Aryan. I mean, the Mufti had blue eyes, fair skin, light hair. Hitler believed that Husseini had Roman blood, and he saw him as someone who could lead the Nazi forces once they arrived in the Middle East. He saw him as, a great ally of the Nazis. He didn't just participate in the Nazis' quest to eradicate the Jewish population of Europe and eventually arrive in Palestine. But the Mufti worked to convince various European leaders not to allow Jewish refugees from fleeing Europe and not allowing them to come to Palestine. He told them, send them to Poland. And he knew very well what was happening in Poland.
So I want to go back to this family in Tennessee, the genesis of this story. And I'm curious, David Shainberg's niece said that at one point in the book, she said that they're Southern, so they sweep ugly under the rug in the South. And so they just didn't talk about that. And when I read that, I thought, actually, that's kind of a Jewish approach, not a Southern approach, except we wouldn't say we sweep things under the rug. We move on, right? We treasure our resilience and we move on from that pain and we build anew. But is moving on really in the Jewish community's best interest? Is that how we end up forgetting and letting this history and this very important history fade?
Absolutely. I think it is possible to do both. It is possible to take great pride in our resilience and on our strength and our ability to experience so much devastation and suffering, and yet every time emerge stronger. I mean, think about the Holocaust. First of all, for many years, we did sweep that under the rug. Survivors were discouraged from speaking about what they went through. They were seen as, especially in Israel, they were seen as, people who went like sheep to the slaughter. It wasn't something to talk about. It was something to move on from. And yet now we are able to hold both in both hands. We're able to honor and commemorate the memory and speak about the atrocities that millions of Jews suffered during the Holocaust, while also celebrating where we went after the Holocaust. I mean, 3 years after the Holocaust, Israel was born. That's just in its own, a remarkable symbol of our resilience and our strength as a people. But I think the way we commemorate the Holocaust is a really great example of how we do both, how we honor the memory and use that as a lesson so that it never happens again. And yet I think that when it comes to the conflict and the various forces that have led us to where we are today, there is this tendency to kind of try to move on and not really speak about how we got here. And it's really a shame, because I think that this is the only way we'll ever find a way out of this tragic cycle of violence, is if we learn how we got here, the forces that continue to drive this conflict after a century, and, the people who brought us here. Not only the Grand Mufti, but also, the leaders today who are very much capitalizing on fear and religion, exploiting religion for their own interests, and utilizing disinformation to remain in power. And I think that, we can't afford not to speak about these things and not to know about our own history. It's really telling that, even in Jewish communities where people know so much about Israel and about this conflict, there's just a complete lack of knowledge of, the very bedrock of this conflict. And I think without that knowledge, we'll never get out of this mess.
Yardena, thank you so much. This is such a wonderful book, and congratulations on writing it.
Thank you so much.
If you missed last week's episode, be sure to tune in for my conversation with Dr. Laura Shaw-Frank, director of AJC's Center for Education Advocacy. We discussed the delicate balance between combating anti-Semitism, safeguarding free speech, and ensuring campuses remain safe for all students. Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #PeopleOfThePod, and hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.